Chapter 6 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Lovers. "Oh, Harry, I'm so indescribably happy." Letty raised her face from the tweed breast in which it had been buried.
"Let me see, darling, how it looks to be indescribably happy."
Harry Thorpe took her face between his hands, smiled into her eyes, and then kissed her very long and tenderly.
"Glad to see me, darling?"
he asked in a hushed voice of utter contentment. "Words can't answer that question, Harry."
"Lips can, Letty. No need for words."
In a passion of love she surrendered herself to his embraces. Never had her lover been so dear to her, never had meeting been so precious to Letty as now, when her nerves were shaken and jarred by the previous night's experience. Yet she dreaded speaking of those fears, which even in his presence she could not wholly banish. Harry was nothing if not practical. He was so full of strong common sense that she felt heartily ashamed of her weakness. Added to which, the lake house would be, if all went well, their future home, and Letty was so alive to all its great possibilities as a delightful residence that she shrank from throwing upon it the smallest shadow. Harry loved it in spite of its gloom, for his imagination could readily picture what it might become under new ownership, and she was intensely desirous of viewing the future through his eyes. "If only last night could be blotted out," she thought miserably through her smiles. In one of his daily letters Harry had announced his coming, and had arranged the place of meeting by the lake, where stood a half-ruined summer-house. It was a desolate enough spot to all but lovers, who are or ought to be impervious to their surroundings, but Harry knew they would be quite undisturbed there. He was perfectly well aware that the place was shunned by all the countryside, but under the present circumstances that was a distinct advantage, and he could have his white rose all to himself without fear of interruption. He was as loath to speak to Letty of the mystery attached to the place as she was loath to mention it to him, and for similar reasons. He had known for some long time of the rumours, and that they were freely discussed in the village, but he treated them with a good-natured contempt, and attributed them to his kinsman's great eccentricities. The sheet of water, still called the lake, was now nothing more than a large pond. The ghost walk led straight to it through the thick wood tangled with undergrowth. The weeds had encroached upon the water year by year. There were deep portions still, and the thickly wooded edges were boggy and treacherous to walk upon, but the side on which the summer-house stood was high ground and perfectly dry. With his arm about her, they strolled along the edge of the water till they reached the dilapidated arbour, and seated there amidst crumbling wood, rank fungoid growth and blanketing moss. Letty looked out and thought how lovely it all was, and how exquisite were the sky gleams of autumn sunshine that filtered through the branches and fell upon the water like golden javelins. "How long can you stay, Harry?"
"I've only got a week, darling. I must set to work with a will now I'm home. We'll spend, however, every hour of it together that we can. Even if the old chap does discover how much we mean to each other, I really don't care a hang."
Alarm leapt into Letty's eyes. "Oh, but he mustn't, Harry. You've no conception how he'd scoff and sneer at us. I couldn't bear it." Harry hugged her closer to him.
"He can't part us anyhow, and what would his sneers matter to us, sweetheart? Another year, and I'll have saved enough to make a nest for my beloved, and we'll be married and live happily forever after. I'm not one of those chaps who are content to wait for dead men's shoes. I prefer my own energy, but I want you to love the lake house, for if I survive Geoffrey Thorpe, it'll be our home, and we'd soon make it look very different to what it is now. It's the people who live within the walls who make or mar the home. Now, tell me how you're hitting it off with the old boy. Your letters are very non-committal."
Letty raised a sudden troubled face from the shoulder on which it rested. "Oh, Harry, darling, I'm not hitting it off. There's nothing to hit off. I might as well be the guest of a mummy that's been buried 1,000 years. Both Mrs. Greatorex and uncle are dumb creatures."
Harry laughed. "Why, isn't the old boy communicative? He must surely talk sometimes. I know he's beastly crusty, and he loathes the sight of me because I'm his heir and he's powerless to disinherit me. And I've come through, but perhaps that's only natural. I'm coming to lunch today."
"To lunch, Harry?" Letty gasped. "You don't mean to say he's invited you? Oh, how thrilling!"
"No, I don't mean to go quite so far as that, darling," retorted Harry rather grimly. "I mean that I'm going to invite myself and see what happens. I'm not going to behave in any secret underhand manner. The lake house is still his property, and it's only right that he should know of my arrival, so I'm coming back with you to lunch. I'm rather in a blue funk. He'll be in a deuce of a rage, but it'll be rather fun to see how he takes it."
"I'm not so sure that it'll be exactly fun, Harry. There's nothing in the least funny about Uncle Geoffrey."
"So you seem to think, darling, but I'm rather big for him to kick out, and I'm so happy today that I feel like bearding Beelzebub himself. Besides, it'll be a sort of satisfaction to get a rise out of that old hag Sarah. If I live to inherit, she'll go in double quick time."
"Oh, but if we go back together, Harry, Uncle will wonder how we met, and there'll have to be explanations," demurred Letty.
"Leave that to me, sweetheart. All you've got to do is follow my lead. I must first of all see in what direction the wind blows."
"It's always in the bleak north here, Harry."
"Except at moments such as this."
He drew her close in tender, sheltering arms. He noted her nervousness, and longed to remove her from her uncongenial surroundings, but at present he was helpless, work as hard as he could.
"My beloved," he whispered, "you look like a white rose today. Come, cheer up. Don't be so scared over nothing. Give me a kiss before we walk straight into the lion's jaws."
As they neared the commencement of the ghost walk leading out of the yard, they fell apart decorously and into silence. He opened the gate for her, then deliberately closed it and followed her into the house.
"Go straight into the lion's den," he whispered. "Don't forget, I'm there to defend you."
With a brave exterior, but with nervous trepidation which made her heart beat thickly, Letty obeyed her lover. The old man was seated in his usual chair, but his head was raised, and his face, scared and blanched to the colour of chalk, was turned defiantly to the door. He had heard the footsteps of a man accompanying his niece. Then, as Harry strode forward and seized his reluctant hand, his whole expression changed from abject fear to bitter sarcasm.
"Harry Thorpe, to what do I owe this unexpected honour?"
Harry, having warmly wrung the hand he had seized, let it drop.
"Oh, sir, you overwhelm me. I seek to confer no honour. Indeed, if you'll only believe it, I am the simplest chap going. I met Miss Thorpe when on my way to pay my respects to you, and naturally I guessed at once who she was. She's told me how awfully kind you are to her, and what a ripping time she's having, and all that sort of thing. And knowing your hospitable nature, I've come to ask for a bit of lunch." "My niece did not invite you?"
The words dropped like ice from the old man's parched lips. He was literally being consumed by the fires of his own fury, and his eyes blazed from out their sunken sockets like those of a wild animal. Harry had turned, apparently quite at his ease, and tossed his cap into a chair. Now he wheeled round again, and his expression was smiling and guileless as that of a child.
"Invite me, sir? Why, no," he laughed reproachfully. "She knew I needed no invitation. Haven't you and I known each other for years, and aren't we kinsmen? How jolly well you look, sir. Been enjoying this fine summer?"
Mr. Thorpe made no reply to the question. He was choking with rage, and his voice was husky and quivering.
"How long do you mean to stay?" "Oh, I'm in no hurry. The White Hart is most comfortable, and everyone's so jolly kind. It's really not such a bad world as some folk make out. Don't you find that really is a lot of kindness knocking about in unexpected places?"
Geoffrey Thorpe turned petulantly aside as Sarah Greatrex entered, and Letty, who was consumed with suppressed merriment when she looked at Harry, and with actual fear when she looked at her uncle's face distorted with rage, seized the opportunity to make her escape. Mrs. Greatrex stalked aggressively forward, bristling with anger, and scowling at the intruder from under her shaggy brows. She was about to speak when Harry forestalled her. He bowed flippantly.
"Morning. Ripping day, isn't it? The sort of day that makes you feel at peace with all the world, purifies the temper and kills the slugs. Mr. Thorpe has kindly asked me to stop to lunch, but I'd be vastly obliged if you'd draw me a tankard of ale straight away. I'm as thirsty as the Sahara. The bacon at the White Hart's as salt as Lot's wife. Or would you rather I saved you the trouble and drew it myself?"
He made a step towards the door, and the two pairs of eyes met as in a duel. Then the woman's eyes fell before the implacable, bright determination they encountered. Without a word she left the room to do his bidding. Harry sat down and fixed his young eyes upon the haggard face of his kinsman. The sun was moving westward. It poured into the old room through the western window, where the escutcheon of the family shone down in stained glass, and the name of Thorpe glowed in ancient lettering. Geoffrey Thorpe had lowered his head, and was fumbling nervously amongst his papers. His claw-like hands shook like withered leaves, and betrayed strong emotion, which Harry suspected to be anger. He glanced away and round the room, waiting for that anger to subside.
"What a pitiful old age," he thought. "What has come to the old man to make him look like that? He might be so happy if he'd let me look after him and pull the old place together and arrest this awful decay. Is there something to hide, or is it a brain disorder?" Harry concluded it must be the latter. What could Geoffrey Thorpe have to hide? He could think of nothing, knowing all his circumstances. The walls of the room he sat in were panelled in diaper-patterned oak, and some fine pictures hung in places. They accorded ill, in their mellowed beauty, with the portrait hanging behind Geoffrey Thorpe's chair. Harry hated it. The furniture, bookcases choked with dust-laden volumes, and heavily carved chairs, were fine specimens dating from the Jacobean days. A couple of richly carved chests gaped open, disgorging rolls of yellow parchment heavily sealed. "What a room for an antiquary to be let loose in," thought Harry. Then Mrs. Greatrex entered, carrying a foaming tankard of battered silver bearing the Thorpe coat. Harry rose and took it from her with a word of thanks, and then, as the door closed behind her again, he turned to his kinsman. "Sir, your very good health." There was no acknowledgment of the toast, and Harry took a long draught. "By Jove, what ale!" he exclaimed. "It's nectar of the gods, drawn pure and cool straight from the cellar. The beer the outside world drinks now is sorry stuff." The old man took no notice of the remark, but continued to fumble amongst his papers. "So this is what Letty has to put up with, is it?" thought Harry. "I'll have another try. Nothing like patience and perseverance. I suppose you take a stroll every day this fine weather?" "I never go out." The reply was rapped forth so sharply that Harry almost jumped. "Oh, that seems a pity," he commented. "Surely it would do you good to get out into the sunshine." No reply was vouchsafed to this suggestion, and at that moment Letty entered, and with a swift smile walked to her chair by the broad latticed window. Harry followed her, and took a seat near, watching her as she sat looking out, with hands folded in her lap. The sunshine gleaming on the pale gold threads of her hair added a vivid calmness, like flowers at evening, to the delicate face. The picture of her seated there amid age and decay stayed with Harry long afterwards.
The wide grey eyes had that liquid look which speaks of a mind full of untold things rather than external objects, nothing blurred or unfinished, but only like a perfect white flower with a faint tinge of colour in its petals. The midday dinner, though strictly plain, was exceedingly good and well cooked. A leg of tender home-grown mutton, served with potatoes that were balls of flour, and a rice pudding to follow. The whole washed down by a 10-year-old brown ale in a foaming goblet. During the meal Harry was thoroughly at his ease. He looked, talked, and acted like one who took for granted the courtesy which he would have exercised himself had the circumstances been reversed. The old man's impenetrable exterior and harsh rejoinders made no more impression upon him than Sarah's face, which was bitter beyond words as she condescended to set the food before them on the table. He kept up a light, running conversation with Letty, who ably seconded his endeavours to be cheerful, but there was one thing the girl noticed that seemed to make no less impression upon her lover than it did upon herself. The portrait seemed to fascinate him against his will, and he stared often at it as if trying to trace some elusive likeness. Turning suddenly from one of those puzzled glances, he met the eyes of Geoffrey Thorpe, furtively watching him.
"Is it a good likeness?" he asked abruptly.
"Yes," was the dry, clipped reply.
"Surely he must have changed greatly since that was painted."
"Possibly."
"It's a most unpleasant portrait," declared Harry. "I've always heard he was a strikingly handsome man, with an extraordinary attractiveness about him. But there's something most forbidding, something defiant and cynical about that chap that I can't stand."
Then he laughingly added,
"Of course you know of the rot talked by some people about here. They swear he isn't dead, that he'll turn up some fine day and revolutionize things here."
Letty, with all her senses strained to acute attention, was conscious that Sarah Greatrex was standing still as if transfixed, and she shot a swift, stealthy glance at Geoffrey Thorpe. The result upon the old man of Harry's careless speech was electrical and startling. His face faded to a ghastly pallor, and he threw an affrighted glance over his shoulder. Then anger seized him, and his voice quivered with half-suppressed passion.
"How dare you repeat that unhealthy gossip in my house?" he demanded. "I'm surprised at your listening to it. You ought to know better. The young man, remember, would not be recognizable now if he were still alive."
Harry smiled indolently and shrugged his shoulders.
"I'm afraid, sir, you can't stop people talking."
How old was Mark Thorpe when he left this country?
"Don't remember," was the gruff retort.
Harry changed the subject, turning to Letty and asking her if she had heard any news of her pupil. "Oh, yes, I had a letter yesterday from her mother. Gladys is not well, and there's just a chance of their not returning to London for some months. In that case I should at once look out for another situation."
"There'll be no necessity for you to do that."
It was Geoffrey Thorpe who spoke, and both the young people glanced at him in undisguised amazement. The tone of his voice had utterly changed. It was conciliatory, almost suave. "I'm well aware, niece, that this is no cheerful abode for the young, but you are welcome to remain here so long as it suits your convenience." Letty had never heard her uncle make so long a speech before, and she stammered out her thanks in rather haphazard fashion. She'd been under the firm conviction that he was counting the days till her departure. Now he offered her unlimited hospitality.
"You know my ways by now, and you do not interrupt me. I am old and a recluse, but if you can put up with these conditions, I shall be pleased if you will remain," he concluded almost gently.
The girl's heart was touched, and she instantly reproached herself for the utterly wrong view she had formed of her uncle's character. She thanked him again most warmly, and the meal being over, she rose and left the two men alone. Geoffrey Thorpe's manner had indeed undergone a startling change, which Harry noticed with secret amazement. He talked now as his kinsman never dreamed he could talk, in a nervous, excited voice, and 2 spots of scarlet shone on his pallid, sunken cheeks. He hobbled to a cupboard and brought out with tender care an old cobwebbed bottle, pressing its contents upon Harry. He seemed terribly anxious to make full amends for his former incivility. Meanwhile, Letty had made her way back to the trysting place by the lake, and, as she surmised, her lover was not very long in joining her.
"Wasn't it a success?" he exclaimed boyishly. "Why, the old chap was simply tumbling over himself to be civil before I tore myself away. Asked me to shoot as many partridges as I liked, and showed me where I'd always find a gun and cartridges. The only stipulation was I wasn't to disturb him more than I could help. It seems he's awfully busy over some old papers he's sorting out, and doesn't want to be interrupted. Says it breaks the thread of something or other. Of course I assured him I shouldn't intrude. I'd just take the gun and hook it if I wished to shoot."
"What can have changed him so suddenly, Harry? I feel utterly bewildered."
Harry laughed cheerfully. "Oh, of course the old chap's awfully dotty," he explained, "and dotty people are never of one mind 2 minutes together. I don't much fancy your being here, darling. At the same time, I'm jolly glad he's invited you to stay on. That was an enormous concession for him to make, and it shows he likes you. I'm his heir, and you're my future wife and future mistress here, and that makes me feel that if you can do anything to make life pleasanter for the old boy, it's a sort of duty to do it."
Letty pondered those words in her heart. Outwardly she fully agreed, but a little spark of suspicion had leapt alive in her, and now she was not so sure of Geoffrey Thorpe's good intentions. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't help seeking for ulterior motives. That swift change from surly, angry antagonism to almost cringing civility was too sudden to be convincing. Such thoughts she determined to keep to herself. She'd no intention of spoiling her lover's holiday by sowing in him the seeds of suspicion which could lead to anxiety on her account.
"I told him I'd be here a week, and that I was putting up at the White Hart," went on Harry in his happy voice, "and that I'd like, if he had no objection, to come and have a look around every day, and he was quite agreeable to that suggestion. So we'll meet here as usual at 11 a.m. and spend our few precious hours together. Oh, Letty, what a joy you are to me, and how you banish the gloom of the old place."
"Yes, I don't think I could have stayed on but for you, Harry." He noted the sudden seriousness of her voice.
"Oh, it's so awfully lonely, you mean?"
"It's not so much the loneliness as—"
"Well, darling, out with it," he urged.
For a moment there was silence. Then she smiled rather wistfully and shook her head. "Oh, let's talk of something else. You'd only laugh at me, Harry."
"Have I ever laughed at you?"
He looked at her now with an anxious expression on his face. She slipped her hand into his. "I don't mean that you'd scoff, but it would be hard for you to understand how curious life is here. However, I mean to stay on because I fully agree with all you've just been saying. Now, don't let's waste any more time. I want to ask you a question."
"Ask on, darling."
"Do you think there's any foundation for that gossip you spoke of at dinner? Could it be that Mark Thorpe is still alive?"
"Foundation? Oh, certainly not. Mark Thorpe's as dead as mutton. If I thought he might be alive, how could I look upon myself as this old man's successor?"
"Oh, tell me about him, Harry. How did he die, and where?" she persisted gently.
He was last heard of on board a ship that never reached port. That must be, over 10 years ago, and it must be over 20 since he left this country. He was an awful scamp, Letty. At one time he was in prison, but that's about all I do know. I was too young at that time to trouble my head about family history. I just remember my father telling me the story before he died." "And did he live here, Harry?" Yes, and squandered a considerable amount of money before he went abroad. I've heard he was wonderfully attractive and plausible, a chap who'd charm a bird off a tree. But that's all old history, finished and done with. Why are you so interested in him, darling?"
Letty smiled. "I am not really interested in him, but in his portrait. It worries me. The eyes follow me about the room."
"I've heard that's the sign of a really good portrait," declared Harry. "You must try, darling, not to let the gloom of the place get on your nerves. Remember how long it's been neglected. But it's capable of great improvements, and some day I hope to make it look very cheerful."
They smiled into each other's eyes and then fell to silence. The sun was moving westward and threw a radiance upon their young faces. They both felt what a wonderful thing in their lives was this deep love for each other, and every fresh meeting brought greater joy than the last. By the pool lay a hush as if all nature extended to them sympathy and understood their bliss. The trees threw great purple shadows upon the blue breast of the water where moorhens swam and dived, and the fish, rising to the flies, cast ring after ring and ripple after ripple to the banks. The sky was silver-grey and brooded like a dove above them. The silence of the lovers seemed more full of meaning than any words they had ever whispered. Flop! A big fish, curved like a half-moon, hurled itself out of the water and dropped down again in a shower of silver spray. Harry sighed and looked at his watch.
"I must be off now, sweetheart. I've promised to look in on one of the old farmers and have tea with him. Tomorrow at the same hour and place."
They strolled together to the dilapidated iron gates, and Harry took her in his arms again. His love for her was unbounded, a love which had leapt alive in that first hour they met in Miss Thorpe's prim Hammersmith parlour 5 years ago. In his way he was as alone in life as Letty was, and the few hundreds a year his dead parents had left him were not enough on which to keep a wife, but his natural energy and perseverance were spurred to their greatest efforts by the promise of the future, and in glowing colours he pictured it with the girl of his heart enthroned as wife in the house his labour would win for her. Letty re-entered the lake house with a light step. For the first time she forgot how dark and dismal it was, and a tell-tale radiance was upon her face as she opened the living-room door. The presence of her uncle recalled her instantly to all the old difficulties. His secretive angry glance was full upon her, and his passion seemed to rise as he noted the signs of happy youth in her shining glance and delicately flushed cheeks. His former conciliatory manner had vanished, and it flashed across Letty that she had only dreamt it.
"How dare you invite that young cub into my house?" he flared out violently. "I thought you understood your position better. I deny you nothing in reason, but I won't permit you to invite people inside my property, my house. Recollect that," he added, banging his bony fist on the table.
"I never invited Harry Thorpe here, and he told you so, uncle." He disregarded her quiet denial.
"I'll not have anyone here," he continued furiously. "I tell you it's strictly forbidden. I won't have anyone spying about me and my belongings. You can tell Thorpe next time you see him to keep his distance. He's no right here till I'm dead. Now, that's all I have to say. You understand?"
Her lover's words came back to her. She had been convinced from the first that her uncle's mind was deranged, and Harry thought the same. It made her accept his violent onslaught with quiet, unruffled dignity. "Yes, uncle, I quite understand, and so far as I am concerned your wishes shall be strictly respected," she replied gently. Then she seated herself quietly in the window and took up her sewing. Not another word passed that night between uncle and niece. Later, when she went to her room, her solitude was lightened by the memories of the day and the blissful hours she had passed with her lover. She could still feel his kisses on her lips and the strength of his sheltering arms. His adoring words came back to her and touched her with the consciousness that she was young and devotedly loved. The future lying before her was radiant with hope. Life was not always to be silent and gloomy, and meanwhile she must bear with the old man's whims and strive to do all in her power to lighten the sadness of his old age. Filled with these thoughts, she undressed and went to bed and to sleep. She was roused thoroughly and completely. In the actual room all was quiet, the window was wide open, and a splash of pale moonlight fell athwart the black oak floor and heavy furniture. It was the same story of the stealthy footsteps down the gallery, the sliding movement of the phantom hand on the wall behind her bed, and then the steps dying away into the distance. In her startled imagination she followed them along the Ghost's Walk, through the dark tangled wood to the lake. She measured the tread of the furtive footsteps in the gallery, wondering if they would return. The lonely night wore on. The clock in the village church tower told off the leaden-footed hours. The pale moon set, and the east grew rosy with dawn, but the footsteps did not return. Gradually her thoughts slid away into that other world through which she loved to wander. Such heavenly dreams, covered with fresh spring fragrance, the grave of the dying and the dead in which she now seemed buried. End of chapter 6.